Hello and welcome to another instalment of History Hack. This is Nighthawk calling, and anyone who still doesn't get that reference, you're still dead to us. And just go on YouTube. It's not difficult, and it is legendary. Alina, who do we have today?
So today I would like to introduce to all of you Emma Butcher, who is a writer, historian, broadcaster, who's specialising in the history of children and war. But today we'll be speaking with her about her new book, The Brontes and War. It looks at the Bronte family and how their writing was influenced by war. So welcome.
Hi, nice to meet you. Weird kind of virtual meeting. But
yeah, absolutely.
Really good to be here.
How is lockdown? So tell us about you and Pudge are locked down together, aren't you?
Yeah, we are. So Pudge is my hamster. So we're having a great time just chilling. He's kind of running around in his ball. I'm cooking things that otherwise I would never learn to cook.
You've been doing selfies with Pudge, haven't you?
I have done some selfies with Pudge. I mean, I don't really have a lot else to do, to be honest. Most people who are in lockdown, it's like, oh, with my dogs or with my cats. And I'm like, well, I've got a hamster who is, I mean, he's not great company during the day. He kind of just sleeps during the day. But at night, I mean, we have a wild time.
Yeah, party time.
Manic.
We've actually, Emma, we've already planned our History Hack Christmas party on Twitter yesterday. So we're so desperate for something to look forward to. People seem to be doing this. They're already discussing what's the first thing you're going to do when you get out, when you're allowed out.
I mean, I think most people are going to go to the pub, right? Because this is where I'm definitely going to go. Basically, I feel like it would be a heroic action going and injecting all my money into pubs. So yeah. I think that's exactly what I'm going to do.
I think they're going to be mobbed.
Oh, it's going to be great. There's this absolutely wicked pub near me called the Palm Tree, which is this old kind of East End London boozer that does a jazz night on a Friday and a Saturday. And I'm going to be going down there, drinking all the Stella and having a dance. Is probably what I'm going to do.
Get on the wife beater.
I think I'm going to have to fly in for this. This sounds quite exciting. Poland sounded quite boring.
Yeah. About it. I'll bring that too.
Let's get on to some history. Alina, kick us off.
So, obviously, many people know that Emily wrote Wuthering Heights. Mm-hmm. Charlotte wrote Jane Eyre, Anne, The Tenant of Wildfell Hall, but some of our listeners might not be quite familiar with the rest of the family. Can you tell us a bit more about them?
Yeah, sure. So there were 4 surviving Bronte siblings. The two elder siblings, Maria and Elizabeth, actually died when they were very young. But the 4 surviving siblings were Charlotte, Emily, Branwell and Anne. And like you say, we kind of know the sisters for their later works. But Branwell was the brother, and even though he didn't go on to publish any kind of he published some poetry, but not any great works. He was instrumental, along with the other 3, in creating a fantasy kingdom when they were children. So right before any of the well-known works were published, all 4 siblings collaborated on this big fantasy saga, which they worked on for about 10 years, between 1829 and 1839. And in it, it's this amazing, wonderful world filled with war and violence and sex and exotic shores. It's amazing.
So their interest in war, I've heard from a friend who is massively in love with the Brontes. How does it start? There's a story about some toy soldiers, isn't there?
It all begins with a box of toy soldiers that their dad, Patrick, brought back to the parsonage because the kids were they were very kind of self-isolated. I mean, it's strange to say that during these times, but they were very much this cliquey unit. So he brought them back some toys to play with, and each of them picked up one of these toy soldiers that he bought them and said, "This will be mine." And it's from this kind of soldier beginning that this universe was created. And that's where their interest in toy soldiers really began.
Now, in terms of a traditional interest in warfare and the events of the day, Patrick the father is perhaps the most traditional, but his children develop in a really different way, expressing their interest. Tell us more about their imaginary worlds.
Okay, so basically once they'd picked up and named these toy soldiers, so Charlotte named hers Wellington, which was after the Duke of Wellington, who was the hero of Waterloo and the celebrated Englishman of the present day. Branwell named his Boney after Napoleon Bonaparte, who was the French adversary, so Wellington's rival at the Battle of Waterloo. And he was seen as this great evil dictator who was looking to take over Europe, but failed. So you've got these two adversaries, these two enemies, these two rivals. And then Emily named hers Gravy because he was a grave little man. And Anne named
I was going to say, is it because he was a northerner? Because that would have been fine.
And also, yeah, gravy in Yorkshire pudding.
Yeah.
And Anne's was a guy called Waiting Boy, so a bit boring. But basically, so from these kind of four people, four kingdoms based on these people were invented. And these four kingdoms, they were Wellington's land, Boney's land, Sneaky's land, and Ross's land. And basically, it started with these kind of four kingdoms which were based on the west coast of Africa. So you can imagine these kind of strange Yorkshire kingdoms mixed in with this exotic African landscape. And from there, they basically, all these white men effectively colonized this west coast and built metropolises and cities and country estates and mills and powerhouses and basically this entire imaginary kingdom. And this is where they started to set all their stories and build up their range of characters and events. So it's very complex. I kind of call it a modern day it's basically a modern day Game of Thrones or Lord of the Rings. It's that complicated.
So I think there's a really interesting point to be had about the influence of colonialism at the time on these as well. But we're going to stick with the military. So perhaps when it comes to how these stories went into their future work, perhaps like with Jane Austen, you can see more obviously the influence of war, can't you? Because there's just lots of soldiers and military characters in her books. But in the Brontes juvenilia, particularly the Angrian stories, you can see the Napoleonic Wars, but it isn't just those, is it? There's a strong connection with earlier the French Revolution, and also there's a lot of shades of republicanism in there as well that's drifted across the channel that they've picked up.
Yeah, absolutely. So the main influence was the Napoleonic Wars, and that really does kind of thread all the way through their narratives. But you're totally right. So Alexander Percy, who's one of the main characters, it's very complicated because the characters evolve over time. So Branwell's original toy soldier Bonaparte eventually evolves into this character called Alexander Percy, who's a revolutionary and a republican, and he constantly stages uprisings which are based on the revolutionary model. So Branwell's very interested in that. But there's also kind of references to early republicanism under Cromwell, and there's references to Milton in there as well. There's references all the way back to ancient warfare. There's a lot of pugilism, which was very much popular during the Georgian period, but there's lots of kind of ancient references. There's references to the Iliad and the Odyssey in these works. There's a range of kind of different types of warfare running all the way back through history, up till even, not just the Napoleonic Wars, but beyond that to the Anglo-Ashanti Wars. And that's where the colonial elements of things really mix in with war, because you have the white colonizers at war with the Ashanti tribes, which are inhabiting their imaginary world, but also were very much real tribes in Africa during the time, and there were lots of periodicals talking about the Anglo-Ashanti Wars. So it's really interesting that the siblings they were really interested in all types of war. Not just big wars, but smaller conflicts. There's references to the American Revolutionary Wars in there, but also just civil conflicts as well. So the local conflicts in England for the Luddites and the Chartists, which were rumblings after the Napoleonic Wars. So this whole spectrum, really. So it's really interesting, to think that they were interested and engaged with just so much war material.
You've mentioned the Duke of Wellington already, and as you said, he's a colossal figure at this time in their recent memory with Napoleon, and especially his rivalry with Napoleon. So I think you've already sort of said yes, but is he the embodiment of a man to look up to? Because Charlotte is a bit obsessed, isn't she? And can we trace people like Wellington in the later characters they come to create, particularly Rochester in Jane Eyre?
Absolutely. So their father, Patrick, was also hero worshipped Wellington. He was a staunch Tory like Wellington. He campaigned for Catholic emancipation, which also was one of Wellington's policies. So incredibly, he was hero worshipped by them. And Charlotte adopted her father's hero worship, kind of a fatherly influence. So Wellington, and what's interesting though is that Wellington's seen as this very kind of steadfast father-like figure in the early saga. And then gradually he mutates. As Bonaparte mutated into Alexander Percy, Wellington eventually mutated into a character called Zamorna, who is Charlotte's kind of teenage bad boy icon in the saga. He's this very sexy, Byronic, dominating character who's got a little bit of kind of evil about him as well. And that really comes as well from not just from kind of pulling away from this kind of father-like figure, but still being interested in authority and bringing in some of the evil characteristics that maybe attracted the British public to Napoleon as kind of this, kind of how we're always kind of interested in kind of the baddies from history. There was this big sensation around Napoleon as well, and his Byronicness and kind of evil demeanor. But what I think is really interesting is this kind of combination of the two and how they do influence very much the masculinities of the later works. So you have characters in Charlotte's fiction like Mr. Rochester, who is very much this authoritative, Byronic figure. Even in Emily's Wuthering Heights, Heathcliff again is this quite kind of bad, but seen as this quite sexy, dominating character. So you can definitely see the elements of military authority filtering through the later works.
I'm quite interested in a bit more about Branwell. So could you tell us a bit more, about his hero, or what we call him an anti-hero, Alexander Percy, and how did he evolve?
Initial toy soldier is Bonaparte, who then transforms into Alexander Percy. And in the early Glasstown sagas, there's a series of tales called Letters from an Englishman, where effectively Branwell's character just incites revolution repeatedly, throwing both his and Charlotte's kingdom into chaos over and over again. And this basically carries on throughout the entirety of their saga. And it's basically Branwell wanting to annoy his sister most of the time, because he just takes his character and he just completely destroys anything that she's built a lot of the time. Things start to get a little bit more complicated in Alexander Percy's and Zamorna's relationship. So Alexander Percy, the Bonaparte, Zamorna, the Duke of Wellington figure. They have a really, really complex relationship throughout the entire saga. And basically, so Alexander Percy has a daughter called Mary, who Zamorna marries. And they both use her as a pawn in their political and war games as well. So you can see that the war between them isn't just necessarily about kingdom. It also infiltrates the domestic zone as well, which I think is really interesting. But Branwell basically, I think it's mainly his aim just to annoy his sister for about 10 years using this character.
So we've talked about, I love it. There's just so, we've talked about the, like the major players like Wellington and Napoleon influencing them. This question's actually come in, from online, and, Inga wants to know, the Brontes also lived in a country where there are many ex-soldiers who have suffered the psychological and physical impact of war. Are they exposed and conscious of these impacts, and how do they relate to their understanding of martial glory and masculinity?
It's really interesting, actually, the way the siblings write about war, because you're totally right. There is, and what we've spoken about so far has been very much the kind of celebrities of warfare. And there is very much this military performativity and this patriotism and these sensationalist kind of war narratives. But there's also this really interesting undercurrent throughout their entire saga of exactly that, the physical and traumatic effects of war. Now, when I first started researching this project, I wanted to know if the Brontes knew any soldiers in Haworth. And even though I found evidence of soldiers in the graveyard, on the baptism registers, etc., there is literally no letter that exists between the Brontes and the Bronte children and soldiers. You know, there's no physical evidence that they ever interacted with any soldiers, although you can assume, with the father being the curate of Haworth, that he would have come into contact with them. But what is very clear is that around the surrounding area of Yorkshire, a lot of mill workers were ex-soldiers. So a lot of the kind of Luddite rebellions and Chartist rebellions were led by ex-militia men. So you can see that the landscape that they're surrounded him definitely did have that kind of military air. In terms of their actual writings and how they write soldiers, so although they didn't talk to any soldiers, or that I can prove, they also were very interested in the military memoir. Now, this was a new genre of fiction that was created during and after the Napoleonic Wars, where for the first time during this kind of late 18th, early 19th century, the soldier started to be treated as an individual human being. So rather than seeing the military en masse, people became concerned with the man behind the uniform. And in order to earn some money, soldiers used to publish their experiences of war. And even though some of those experiences were travel narratives or kind of sentimentalized dialogue, some of them contained real elements of trauma. And although the term war trauma didn't actually exist during that time, it was open to all of these labels such as cannonball wind and nostalgia. You can read these kind of memoirs and see what soldiers are feeling and how they're reacting to war. And in the Brontes saga, so they were reading these memoirs and they read them through the periodicals that came into the parsonage. So they were published in things like Blackburn's Edinburgh magazine and the United Service Journal, which their father subscribed to. They then took that, processed that, and reimagined that in their writings, and they created these soldier characters. There's one called John Flower, for example, one called Henry Hastings, who were these ordinary foot soldiers who were in the regiments underneath the Duke of Wellington figure, so Zamorna. And these soldiers would keep diaries of their events and their battles, and also the physical and mental effects of these battles. So you get this evidence that the Brontes understood the signs of trauma, so melancholia and nightmares and feeling distant. And there's this absolutely wonderful poem that Zamorna writes, which is, well, written by Charlotte Bronte, but under her pseudonym Zamorna. Do you think I could read it?
Yeah, let's.
Yeah? Yeah? Okay, so Zamorna, so this is her chief character, but basically I think this is a really good example of how they understand trauma. So he's just come back from battle and he's trying to go to sleep, but he can't. And he writes, "He could not sleep, his temples pressed to the hard pillow throbbed with pain, the belt around his noble breast, his heart's wild pulse could scarce restrain, and stretched in feverish unrest, awake the great commander lay. The sods of battle round him welter, in noble blood that morning shed, and gorged with prey and now declining, from all the fire of glory won, watchful and fierce he lies repining, over what may never be undone." So it's this kind of recognition of the kind of effects of war, him kind of repeating the effects of war over and over in his mind in this kind of mental prison. And you have other characters as well, like I said, exhibiting signs of melancholia. And a lot of them are taking drugs and drinking alcohol in order to cope in the kind of final tales of the Angrian saga when a lot of the wars have been over. So it's really interesting thinking that the Brontes, from a position where they were born after the Napoleonic Wars and they were just reading accounts of soldiers, they actually ended up understanding the more mental effects that war had upon the kind of returning population.
That's just fascinating. I'd never considered that. Inga, actually, part of her degree, I think, was the Brontes, which is why she was coming at you with such an involved question, and she was really excited that you were coming on.
Hey, I was really excited to answer it. So.
Yeah. There's arguably some influence from other artists and their responses, and then their responses to war as well that have filtered down into the Brontes. I'm thinking particularly of Byron. How did he inform the Brontes' writing? And also Walter Scott?
So Walter Scott's really interesting because he was the popular novelist of the time. I mean, everyone hates him now, it seems. No one decides in this period of isolation, you know what, I'll pick up some Walter Scott.
Yeah.
So, but in the 19th century, he was this popular novelist of the day, and the children actually read a lot of his works very early on, including, so by the age of 10, they'd read his entire 8-volumed Life of Napoleon, which
wow.
I tried to read a little bit, and I could not even penetrate the first paragraph, so good on them. So they had, but Walter Scott was doing this really interesting narrative technique at the time called fog of war, as it's been coined after. But basically, in line with this idea of the British public reading war or reading kind of military memoirs, Walter Scott was writing war so that the British public who never experienced war could be in the centre of the action. So this sense of the battle raging around, you could be sitting in your armchair at home and have the battle raging around you, and you've got bullets flying past you, and you're in the fog of war, you're in the midst of everything. And this technique was quite new. It wasn't this formal stiff account of war. It was this very exciting sensationalist idea. And this is what the Brontes really picked up from Scott. And in their juvenilia, especially Branwell, he's writing these kind of very complex stream of consciousness war narratives, like he's right involved and in the centre of the action. So that's what I think is really interesting, that he's picking up kind of artistic kind of narratives from these writers. Byron's really interesting because not only does he have mixed views on Napoleon, which Branwell imitates within his own verse, so they were both interested in Napoleon's fall from grace. Byron also was a big critic of war. So he wrote verse directed at the Duke of Wellington after Waterloo, saying, "What have you gained by this? What have you gained by Waterloo?" And this is something that the Brontes took on board, and they realised that war was not just this one-dimensional sensationalist, exciting narrative. There were these moments of awareness of the cost of war, which I think that primarily they got from writers such as Byron. And in their saga, they would, in the middle of battle narratives, they would pause and sometimes quote Byron in this moment of kind of reflection, this moment of awareness in their narrative. So, for example, in one Civil War battle, the battle's raging and everything's kind of going off left, right and centre, and suddenly Branwell pauses and he just writes from Don Juan, "Here pause we for the present, as even then that awful pause dividing life from death." And this is directly lifted from Byron's verse. So he just uses Byron to kind of penetrate his own writings and create these kind of brief moments of awareness of the real cost of war, which I think is really interesting. So they're adopting all of these kind of writers' own viewpoints and styles and bringing it into their own work in this kind of crazy mosaic.
I just, you liked Inga's last question. To me, they sound like terrifying exam questions, but you seem to love the last one, so I'm going to hit you with this one. With these sagas that they created, To what extent are they fan fiction of their day?
It's 100% fan fiction. That's exactly what it is. I recently helped write an article about were the Brontes juvenilia the first kind of Dungeons and Dragons, because this is kind of what they are. It's a mixture of role playing and fan fiction. So I think that a lot of the juvenilia gets dismissed because a lot of scholars think that it's just, three geniuses, well, four in my opinion, including Branwell, kind of testing the waters and trying things out, and it's all a bit of a mishmash and it doesn't reveal their kind of true genius like their later works. But, instead, this is a really important work which basically is not only it doesn't only reveal their early genius into their later works, but it also collects all of the opinions, all of the artistic narratives, all of the kind of publications of the present day, which they're lifting things from and then creating a collage. So it's kind of all this second-hand information, which, it's imitative, and sometimes you don't know what they've written or whether they've plagiarized it, but that's important in itself, right? That's exactly kind of what fan fiction is taking something and adding to the story. And this is exactly what they're doing. They're writing down, which is great for historians because you can see what's important to the everyday person and how children are reacting to war and all of this stuff. And then they're creating something wonderful out of it. It's great fan fiction. I mean, I don't know what Wellington and Napoleon would think of it if they read it. It's a little bit racing, they're also, their relationship is very much this homosocial, very kind of strange, imagined thing. But I think it's really, really interesting seeing how they imagine all of this stuff. And it's very much role-playing fan fiction. That's exactly what it is.
You've definitely sold it to me. Alina, I know that something Emma said earlier on has sparked a question with you, hasn't it?
Yeah, it's more of a social question, really. Basically, you mentioned earlier about the self-isolation that the Brontes actually lived in. I want to know how severe it actually was. Has it been over and exaggerated? Because they're obviously incredibly well educated, and we know they were exposed to periodicals and other things that meant that they're not culturally cut off from the outside world, even if they were actually physically.
So I think there's been a lot of myths that have built up over the Brontes over the years. And one of the big myths is that they were kind of physically isolated in this parsonage on the moors, which just isn't true, because Haworth was actually this very bustling industrial town with a lot going on in it. There was a lot of artists that lived there, across music and art, and generally they were very exposed to a lot of culture. They regularly went to concerts in nearby towns like Keighley and Bradford, so they were very much in this kind of cultural hub. With their father being the curate, they would have had interactions with the villagers, etc., etc. The main thing about the Brontes, though, is that apart from Charlotte, who had two friends, her best friend was Ellen Nussey, the siblings kind of kept themselves to themselves. That's the main thing. Even though that they weren't necessarily cut off physically, they weren't lonely on the moors, they decided they were very much this kind of clique, and they spoke to one another and they acted out these plays to one another. But they didn't act them out to the outside world at all. They were very much in their own little imaginative bubble, if that makes sense. So even though they were exposed and they had access to a lot of culture, they were kind of self-isolated in a way, in the sense that maybe they didn't, trust people outside of their initial kind of group, in the sense that this was something very special and very personal to them. Even their father couldn't read their stories because they wrote them on these really tiny, probably about 5 centimetre books, which were all done in quill and ink, but all in very small hand, which only they could kind of read and discuss.
Isn't there a throwdown as well between Charlotte and Emily over Charlotte reading Emily's poetry and how long it took her to convince her to even publish it?
Yeah, absolutely. Like even in the juvenilia, so it started off with all four of them collaborating together. And then in 1832, Charlotte and Branwell break off to become their own two, and Emily and Anne break off and they become just two writing pairs. I think maybe because Charlotte was too bossy. I think she was quite bossy all her life. But, you know, this sense of, you know, Emily was very, you know, you can see that kind of animosity between them existed even, when Charlotte wanted to publish Emily's poetry and read her work. So that was there even in the early writings as well, that sense that they kept up to date with each other. But Emily and Anne certainly felt kind of sidelined in the early writing kind of stages. Like all of the early Glasstown works are all written by Charlotte and Branwell. And even though Emily and Anne are characters and evidently have some input, they're not the leaders whatsoever.
Kind of think if they had come up with better names for their characters than Gravy and the other one, they may have been taken more seriously by their siblings.
Potentially. I mean, I actually think so. Emily and Anne's world of Gondal is it's incredible. So we've got loads of the angrier stories left. So you can read lots of Charlotte and Branwell's writings. There's mounds and mounds. But Gondal, which is what Emily and Anne broke off to write in 1832, none of the prose survives of it. There's only poetry, and probably about 150 poems of that survive. But what we do know is that it was this incredible kind of craggy, rocky Yorkshire landscape with prisons and kind of, you know, moors and mountains. And it was basically ruled by this feminist Amazonian warrior queen called Augusta Geraldine Almeida, who used to basically start wars with a lot of men and get men to fall in love with her, then break their hearts, and they'd either commit suicide or be thrown in a dungeon. So that's pretty much what Emily and Anne were up to after they left Angria.
It must be heartbreaking for you as a researcher that the prose doesn't survive.
Well, the rumours were that, I mean, back to that Charlotte and Emily kind of animosity. So the rumour was that Charlotte actually got rid of it all, that she burned it or got rid of all of the kind of prose elements. Like there's rumours that Emily was definitely working on a second book by the time that she died. And there's no manuscript of that either, that Charlotte got rid of that as well. I mean, that some people say that Emily was buried with it, but you know, the likelihood is that Charlotte got rid of it because she was very interested in preserving her sister's image after her death. So I think that a lot of things were destroyed by her. I mean, who knows? Stories keep turning up over the years of Angria. Like recently, there was a book that turned up that had been in a shipwreck and had turned up in some kind of auction house, and it contained a juvenilia story in it. You know, stuff, and that was in 2017. So stuff keeps getting discovered all the time. So who knows? The Gondal prose could be out there somewhere.
Fingers crossed. Now that we're in self-isolation, I say we set up, the three of us, a WhatsApp group and start our own mad little world. I can already think of one general dictator to oversee it. So we'll start that after to see how far we get before we actually get let out of the house. And it will give you someone other than Pudge to talk to during the day. But Emma, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me on.
No, thank you for telling us all about the Brontes and how war influenced their writing. I think you're right. I don't think you can divorce the childhood stuff from their later quality of their later work, because it all seems to intertwine together, doesn't it?
It does, certainly, yeah. It's just a great world. I love sharing it with everyone. So.
And you have shared this subject with everyone, haven't you? Tell everyone about your book.
So my book has just been published. It came out in January. It's called The Brontes and War, Fantasy and Conflict in Charlotte and Branwell Bronte's Youthful Writings. And it's published by Palgrave and available online everywhere now.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Emma, for joining us.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Join us tomorrow when we will be learning all about the history of Afghanistan from the 1960s up till about 1999-2000. This is with Kamal Haider, who is a preeminent journalist in the region and a senior correspondent for Al Jazeera English, and he also happens to be my uncle as well. It's an absolutely fascinating interview. Don't forget, you can now become a patron of History Hack for as little as $1 a month by going to www.historyhack.podbean.com. It's all muchly appreciated and will help keep us going in the aftermath of the corona crisis. There now follows a public service announcement.
I'm Horatio Hornblower.
And I'm Archie Kennedy. The simplest gift you can give in these troubled times is to obey orders.
Indeed. The regulations are very clear in the matter. It is the duty of all of us to remain at anchor and to the little people in the talking box signal you otherwise.
You don't want to end up getting flogged.
Good day to you.
Good day to you both.